Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. So today we're putting on our regional security analyst hats to unpack a really massive shift happening in global defense strategies right now. We're looking at a super complex and honestly increasingly urgent question. Are U.S. military bases in the Middle East still a strategic asset, or have they actually evolved into a liability? To build the foundation of our briefing today, we're drawing directly from a really fascinating in-depth report published over at sunnafiles.com. Their research dives into the extreme fallout from the 2026 war with Iran, a conflict that completely stress-tested the Middle East security architecture in ways we literally haven't seen in decades. So, this isn't just some dry conversation about troop movements or budget lines. We're talking about the very balance of power, the nature of sovereignty, and the future of deterrence in one of the most volatile regions on the map. Let's get into it. Here is a quick look at our agenda. We'll be moving through 5 key areas: the base strike catalyst, post-colonial security shifts, protection versus regional exposure, autonomy and operational constraints, and finally, the strategic vacuum. All right, starting with Section 1, the base strike catalyst. Let's look at the inciting incident that essentially forced the entire region to wake up and rethink its defensive posture. To really wrap our heads around the current strategic debate, we have to look closely at what went down during the 2026 conflict with Iran. During the absolute height of the escalation, Iran did something that completely changed the calculus. They directly targeted a massive network of U.S. bases across the Gulf. We are talking about critical, incredibly sophisticated military infrastructure located in Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. The goal here was highly tactical. Iran wanted to surgically disrupt the very nervous system that lets Washington project its military power across the region. And this sequence of events completely shattered a geopolitical assumption we've held onto for years. This idea that simply having a U.S. base on your soil meant you were untouchable. No way. Suddenly, the very presence of those foreign bases painted a massive bullseye right on the host nations. Which brings us to this brilliant, kind of wild irony highlighted by both Channel 12 and the sunnafiles.com report. The Gulf states basically found themselves under direct fire, specifically because they were hosting U.S. military infrastructure. But when the ballistic missiles and drones were actually flying through the air, their physical defense relied mostly on domestically operated, American-made defense systems, along with some highly advanced Israeli systems used by the UAE. It's a huge paradox, right? The foreign military bases brought the immediate threat right to their front door, but it was their own local operational readiness that actually had to step up, fend off the attack, and secure their airspace. Okay, moving into Section 2, post-colonial security shifts. Because to understand how we got to this tense moment, we really need to look at the history of regional security as a developing narrative. If we look back, there's a really stark contrast between past colonial presence and the strategic challenges we're seeing today. Back in the mid-20th century, Britain pulled its forces out of the region, which effectively ended an era of overt territorial colonial control. But as you can imagine, that exit left a massive power void. So by the late 20th century, the United States stepped in to fill it. But they used a very different model. Instead of colonial annexation, the U.S. became the cornerstone of a modern Gulf security architecture. The whole mandate was to maintain regional balance through strategic deterrence and keep those vital global energy routes totally secure. Then, rolling into the 21st century, the main target of that American deterrence shifted away from a contained Iraq and squarely onto an expanding Iran. And that historical through line? That brings us right to April 2026. Those direct strikes didn't just break concrete, they exposed the deep vulnerabilities of this modern deterrence model, forcing a massive, region-wide strategic reevaluation. And that leads us straight into Section 3, protection versus regional exposure. This is where the debate gets incredibly layered for regional leaders. So here is the structural dilemma right at the heart of our briefing today. It is a profound trade-off. On one hand, hosting U.S. forces is undeniably a massive security asset. I mean, it gets you access to top-tier American defense systems, it massively reinforces deterrence against aggressive neighbors, and it keeps critical economic lifelines, like energy routes, open for business. But let's look at the other side of the ledger. It's a growing liability. Hosting these forces inherently transforms sovereign nations into frontline targets the second a broader regional conflict kicks off. It gives them direct, completely inescapable exposure to adversaries who honestly might not have had any strategic reason to strike their territory otherwise. As an analyst, this looks like an agonizing burden. Host nations are essentially buying the ultimate insurance policy, but that exact policy inadvertently increases the likelihood of their house catching fire in the first place. And what's fascinating is that this dilemma is actively spreading across the geopolitical map. According to our source material, Israeli defense planners are actively locked in this exact same debate right now. Reportedly, Israel is considering requesting expanded U.S. military facilities on its own territory. Now, obviously, the intent behind deepening ties with Washington is to project an absolutely impenetrable layer of deterrence, but it introduces the exact same exposure risks that the Gulf states are dealing with. Seeking that tighter, more permanent security umbrella brings the very calculated risk of becoming a much more prominent, direct target for adversaries in any future escalation. Let's shift gears to Section 4, Autonomy and Operational Constraints. Because the liability of hosting foreign bases isn't just physical exposure, there's a really heavy political cost too. Let's talk about strategic autonomy. At its core, this is a nation's capacity to make independent geopolitical and military decisions. Well, when a nation agrees to host a massive, permanent U.S. military presence, that autonomy is inherently restricted. This is the ultimate trade-off between strategic deterrence and the loss of local control. Think about it. If you want to conduct independent military operations in your own backyard, or even make a unilateral diplomatic pivot, you suddenly have to run it up the flagpole in Washington. You have to have this incredibly tight, rigorous coordination to avoid conflicting with the U.S.'s broader global posture. You lose a huge chunk of operational freedom. So host nations are increasingly having to ask themselves exactly how much sovereign decision-making and local independence are we willing to just trade away for this overarching security umbrella? Finally, we hit Section 5, the strategic vacuum. So the obvious question is, if the bases are such a massive liability, why not just demand they pack up and leave? Well, let's look at this quote from Yoel Gazansky at the Institute for National Security Studies, which is featured prominently in the sunfiles.com report. He says, and I quote, "Their absence could create a strategic vacuum, potentially granting Iran greater freedom of movement, expanding its influence, and increasing its capacity to apply pressure. In geopolitics, power absolutely abhors a vacuum. If the U.S. withdraws, that space is going to get filled by someone."
But this is actually a heavily debated topic among analysts because removing the U.S. presence completely isn't a simple magic wand. It presents a stark duality. On one side, as we just discussed, a base-free region creates a dangerous strategic vacuum, opening the door for expanded Iranian influence and dialed-up military pressure on the Gulf states. But let's flip the perspective. Removing distant foreign powers could actually be favorable for long-term regional peace. Historically, foreign meddling by distant countries has proven absolutely disastrous in the Middle East. I mean, we only have to look at the long-term destabilization and sheer chaos that followed U.S. interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. A region entirely void of that foreign military footprint might actually eliminate a massive liability. It could force local actors to finally sit across the negotiating table from one another and hammer out their own organic, localized stability.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly persistent dilemma. Is hosting these forces a strategic cost or a security gain? The Middle East remains caught in this almost unsolvable equation right now. The U.S. bases expose these nations to high-stakes conflicts, yet they also completely shape the entire deterrence architecture of the region. There's no easy answer here, and honestly, there's no clear resolution in sight. So based on all of this, what do you think the region's next move should be? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the tough questions.